I'm JJWalsh here in Hiroshima, Japan. And today I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Nelson in Tokyo at Meiji University. Thanks so much for joining, Lindsay.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, today we're talking about your really interesting book, Circulating Fear, about how Japanese horror themes can relate in very interesting, insightful ways to Japanese society around the world, in fact. And ideas of sustainability are also things that we're going to talk about today, not only about social impact of things that are viewed, but there is a bit of environmental impact as well that I think we're going to discuss today. I'm so excited to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So, your book, your analysis, and using horror as a lens, how did you get interested in looking at Japanese horror and how it relates to things in reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was a horror fan from a very young age, and that gradually grew into an interest in Japanese horror, both when I first lived in Japan and also in grad school, where I took some seminars that focused a lot on contemporary horror cinema. And I think that the idea that Japanese horror is connected to certain social problems and social issues has been there from the start, since the sort of J-horror boom period of the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of scholars have been writing about how Japanese horror really often focuses on things like loneliness and depression and social isolation and domestic abuse and neglect and just a lot of the sort of hot button issues that Japan has dealt with in the past few decades. And so I was kind of looking at that and also looking at it through the lens of new media and the way that new media objects and new media technologies have really been central to a lot of Japanese horror narratives, beginning as far back as movies like The Ring and One Missed Call and Pulse. But now, those movies were kind of focused on things like floppy disks and, the internet and television. Whereas now, more recently, these movies are focused on things like YouTube and Nico Nico and Nichanaru. And so, the content, I guess, is not new, but the way we think about it and the way it appears in these movies and the way it appears in marketing for these movies has definitely changed a lot.
Yeah, definitely. How we get the information, how we watch the horror on our phones, which is also so integrated into our daily life. You're talking about in the book how that like heightens the fear, right? That
Yeah.
heightens the whole topic because it's so much more an engaging part of how we live our lives, right?
Yeah, I think, in the past, at least the television was maybe something that we could turn off and we could walk away from at the end of the day. But now I think a lot of us live in this world where our smartphones are an extension of our bodies and we sleep with them next to us on our pillows. And people often joke about how, oh, I'm going to quit Twitter, I'm going to quit Instagram, but we don't. A lot of us don't because we feel compelled to continue using them, but also because they're inextricably tied to our work and to our social lives. And, we don't want to lose that connection, even though it can also be really damaging to us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. Let's go through the book a little bit, introducing the chapters. So, your title, Japanese Horror Fractured Realities and New Media, we touched on a little bit. It looks like in chapter one, you kind of introduce the idea of this new digital medium and how engaging with horror as well as our daily lives being so dependent on digital medium for Zoom calls and our work now during coronavirus. Did you write this during the pandemic?
You
It
know,
seems so related.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this book began a very long time ago with some conference presentations that I did, and one chapter was published elsewhere. An earlier version of it was published elsewhere, and some of the thinking goes back like 10 years. But yes, definitely. A lot of the editing and the revising happened during the pandemic, so it was unavoidable to be thinking about it in that context. And in particular, the conclusion, I talk about that a little more specifically. But I think just living through the pandemic and seeing the impact that Zoom had on our lives, the different way that we started to think about screens and smartphones and kind of our digital lives. Yeah, it kind of created a whole new level to a lot of this horror. And more specifically, there were actual directors out there, both Japanese and non, who started to make these like Zoom-based horror films, or movies like Shadow, which was a short film that the director actually filmed during quarantine, in his house with his wife. And so, you had both these specific films that were actually making use of a lot of pandemic era realities, but then you had other films that were older that suddenly people were just kind of looking at in a new way. Because I think for a lot of us, we were comforted by this, to have this technology, of course, because it was less isolating, but it also quickly became really stifling. We were kind of trapped in screens in a way. And so I think that the horror that dealt with that sort of technology kind of spoke to us in a new way during the pandemic.
Ah. And you teach, of course, you teach university students at Meiji University. And we were talking a little bit before we started how you're teaching content courses in English conversation, but you do touch on a lot of these Japanese horror examples. How do your students react? Because I think even more than our generation, your students, the 20-year-olds, are so connected to their smartphones. And a lot of the horror that you talk about is using the smartphone as a way to connect with them. You can't escape it, right?
Yeah.
And I think young people especially feel that way.
Yeah, I learned so much from my students, as the kind of old person who is perhaps not as connected as they are. But yeah, they definitely have a different perspective on this than I do, as people who are even more constantly connected than I am. And my classes, so like a lot of foreign professors in Japan, I teach content-based English classes. So I teach English classes with titles like Gender in English Language Media, or idols and celebrity culture or something like that. And I don't actually put the word horror in my course titles, just because I find that the students tend to be scared of horror and they won't come to the class if I put that title in. So instead, I kind of sneak the horror content in there just a little bit occasionally. I do have one class called Haunted Japan, which is very specifically about spooky stuff. But yeah, the students, I think, one example that I always remember is that in one of my classes, I occasionally pose the question, you know, do you have any screen-free time? When is your screen-free time? Like when do you disconnect? And the students have looked at me blankly and just been like, when I sleep. I guess, like they don't, a lot of them just don't have a concept of being disconnected. Like they're always online, they're always corresponding and chatting. And and I don't want to be the old fuddy-duddy who says, oh, this is dangerous, and you're hurting. It's like, this is their lives, this is how they've grown up. And I do think that perhaps as they get older, they will maybe start to realize that they should step back just a little bit occasionally. But they grew up with this from infancy, in a way that I didn't. So I have to remember that too.
Yeah. I know there's so much pressure, right? About replying to messages really fast, always having your phone on you. If you don't reply within an hour, you have to have a deep apology. It's really deep, like the embedded culture to messaging and social media now for young people, especially in Japan, is really strong. But you touched on something that I thought was really interesting. I've been following a new series by Pod Save America by John Favreau. He's doing a series called Offline, talking to people so embedded in media in the States and finding ways to get offline and escape the screen. And I thought that's really interesting contrast and interesting relation to what you're talking about in your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so ironic to me that we have spent so many decades building and celebrating these technologies that get us so connected, and now people are sometimes paying huge amounts of money to go to places where there is no cell phone signal, and you can go to these retreats in the woods where there's no cell phones allowed, because for some people that is quite literally the only way that they can actually disconnect from something. I was a late adopter. I actually put off getting a smartphone for quite a while and was made fun of it relentlessly by coworkers and friends. And then, I joined in like everyone else, and now I have my phone on me at all times. But I don't know. I think, again, maybe because I'm of a slightly different generation than my students, I don't have as much trouble disconnecting every now and then, and in particular, I don't feel this pressure to reply instantly to messages, and I'll reply when I'll reply, and that's not really a big deal. But I do feel for them in that sense. I feel for them for the horrific social pressure, because social pressure is already bad enough, I think, when you're a teenager, and to have the added level of digital social pressure must just be really, really hard.
Yeah. I've heard from students, including my own kids, that having rules by the school about no
Mm-hmm.
phones on in the
Mm-hmm.
school, no phone use in the school,
Mm-hmm.
us having rules about certain times of the day when they have to turn it off. And at first they complain, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but then they realize the benefits
Mm.
of not being the one who made that rule.
Yes,
That
yes,
they can tell their friends that's a really easy excuse.
yes,
Sorry, my mom said I can't be online,
yes,
or my school said, right? So
yes.
being strict in that way is, it
Mhm.
has an added benefit, I think, to get kids
Yeah.
off the hook
I
for the
think so too, yeah, when someone else is the bad cop, I think that makes a big difference, definitely.
yeah. That is so interesting. I love this picture from your chapter one. The all the layers of
Yeah.
you're taking a picture of it as you're watching someone
Mhm,
in the horror film,
mhm.
watching horror on his screen. It's like looking in a mirror, right? All the
Yep.
reflections.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that, as I was working on the book, I was frequently watching a lot of these films on my own laptop, in my own apartment, on my desk, and then I noticed, as in these photos, that I was watching other people watching video on a laptop, and it became this kind of, funhouse mirror situation, and I think I write as well about the idea of both digital and physical clutter. So if you're uh, watching um, this movie, you see sometimes in movies like Unfriended, or some of the Knee Channel Curse series, where a lot of it takes place on a laptop. You not only see the video itself, you see the little icons in the background, and then if you are watching yourself on a laptop, you have your own icons and your own digital clutter in the background. So again, it really blurs the lines between what is the content and what is your own life. And I know that I had a particularly unnerving experience where I think that the movie Unfriended famously takes place entirely within the confines of a Skype call. So as you're watching it, all you're seeing is like what we're seeing now. And as I was watching it on my laptop, I received a Skype call, and it beeped at me, and I kind of like jumped out of my skin because in that brief moment, I didn't know if it was the film or if it was a friend calling me. So, yeah. So, and I think that's very conscious. Those kinds of effects that we now see in a lot of these new horror films. And I talk in the book as well about how the marketing for these kinds of films is also taking advantage of that. Where if the film is about an app, or some kind of internet related thing, that the marketing will often include some sort of creepy message that you will receive online, or on your computer, and that just kind of adds to the creepiness factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a great interview you did, which we're going to refer to when we talk about idols and horror in the next section. But you mentioned there was one movie maker who, if you downloaded the app before you
Mm.
watched the movie, that they would send you a message during the movie,
Yes.
which is related to the movie. And I
Yes.
thought, that's really clever
Yeah.
and very sinister.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there. I think way, way back in the days of the Blair Witch Project, we had kind of the first viral marketing campaign before the internet was a thing, and now it's just become commonplace to play things up on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram, and to have these kind of viral stunts like with the English language Rings film, where they set up this fake TV store with a fake screen and had people shopping for TV stores, and then an actual person would crawl out of the screen and people would scream. And yeah, one of the marketing campaigns for one of the Ring sequels involved actually registering at some website, and then while you were watching the movie, you would get a call, and this voice would say 7 days or something like that. So I think it makes sense, given that movie theater attendance has been declining for a very long time, and the old model of just relying on people paying for either movie tickets or DVDs or something is long gone. And obviously, a lot of people just download their movies or watch them on YouTube or something. So I think that obviously companies have had to get very creative with how they sort of promote engagement, because everybody wants the engagement, which can lead to free advertising, which can lead to, just more sources of revenue, basically. So
That's just wild, isn't it? But it shows, like, even The Ring, which is probably the most famous Japanese horror film that people around the world would know.
mhm,
They have updated, right, from
mhm.
videotapes, which maybe people
Yes,
don't relate to
right.
now, to really engaging with what people are using right now. So the makers themselves are so engaged with like pop culture and how people live their lives, and finding ways to to get them where they are. And that's kind of a common theme of your book, right?
Yeah, I think that on the one hand, I often feel like the Japanese film industry, at least the major studios, are stuck in the dark ages when it comes to how they, promote and distribute and make their films. But in many ways, they're actually very much having their finger on the pulse of what people are interested in, and they do know. Which types of social media platforms to really target, and which types of people, will be interested in this one thing. I'm just seeing this comment from Colleen Laird here. Colleen Laird here saying, "I'm imagining getting a text from Lars von Trier in mid arrest, and I'm beside myself with terror." Yes, that would be really frightening. I think I've lost your audio for just a second.
I also wanted to
Okay.
mention Enrique's comment
Yes.
about stopping to watch horror
Mm,
because of the connection with
mm.
perceptions of
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah. You
How
start to see ghosts
interesting,
everywhere. Yes. Yeah.
and not being able to escape.
Hmm.
Oh, this could bring us. Thanks for joining, Colleen. It's great to see her here. Now, both of you have done some collaborative work as well on reviewing horror films through Ego Files, right?
Yes, so Professor Laird has done an amazing series of video interviews on Japanese horror. I'm included. Dr. Rachel Dumas is there. Also, Dr. Stephen Brown, Catherine Hemmen. And these are all conversations about different Japanese horror movies. And more recently, just more general videos about mise en scène and cinematography. And yes, we also have a website where we look at just Japanese cinema in general, but my reviews on that website also tend to focus on Japanese horror.
Yeah. Now, you had a great interview with Colleen Laird, who's in Canada. Is that right?
Yes, Canada and Washington.
And it really connected to your chapter too. Let's start with that interview because it was kind of a main theme of your connections between idol culture and Japanese horror and the actual realities and the gender inequity of a lot of the idols, but also it kind of reflected on a lot of gender issues in Japan in general, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, there's been a lot of really interesting scholarship on idol culture and gender over the last couple of years. Patrick Galbraith and Jason Carlin have really covered this a lot. And for me, what I was particularly interested in was that there is this sort of genre of what I call idol horror, where there are, of course, pop idols in Japan, both individuals and groups. Um, Often appear in movies. They're cross platform performers, so they're always appearing in TV shows, commercials, movies, and but in particular, they seem to be popping up in a lot of horror films. And on the one hand, this wasn't surprising because I think in a horror film, you often have young women as victims, so they just have to run around and scream a lot. Also, a lot of these horror films are found footage or found footage style, so the idols can sort of ad lib. They don't really have to have a script, and they don't really have to do a lot of complicated acting because some of them are not necessarily trained performers. And for me, I just really started to notice how, perhaps inadvertently, a lot of these films, while they were about ghosts and monsters and scary things, they were also kind of a portrait of the dark side of the idol industry. Because in Shirome, one of the films that I talk about, one of the themes of the film is how this group of very young women, I think the youngest was like maybe 13 or 14 years old, they're all teenagers, are just expected to be eternally cheerful. And they are put in these, scary situations where they're like going to a haunted school and stuff, and they know it's not real, but still they're kind of playing it up as if it's real. But just the whole time, how they keep going back to this, I have to do my best for the company, and we have a duty to the fans, so everything's fine, it's all okay. And at some point, it just starts to feel kind of deranged, that these young women are expected to just be cheerful all the time. And I think you see an even darker version of this in a much, much earlier film called Psychic Vision, or Jagande, which is about a young woman, a pop idol, and the recording of her new music video, and how it kind of touches on a sort of haunted cassette tape and this kind of cursed song, which comes up in a lot of other idol horror films as well. But there too, you just kind of see how this young woman is just sort of treated as a thing and a commodity, and is repeatedly put in a lot of danger within the narrative, not in reality. And it all just comes down to, we have to get the shot, we have to get this video, and it doesn't really matter who dies as a result. Yeah, so that's something I just started to notice more and more as I looked at the depiction of pop idols, especially female pop idols in horror films.
Yeah, it's a really interesting part of, I think, Japanese society, because you have this exploitation of young women and making them into these sexy icons, even really young girls in these pop bands. And then you also push this pressure of the gaman idea, and they should be grateful for being famous, but their actual reality is really horrible and exploited,
Hmm.
and they don't have much independence, they're not able to live normal lives, and the fans are king, right? The old idea of customers are king, but the fans are really king, and they're expected to gaman, like you say many times, and just take it, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that there's a wonderful documentary on Netflix called Tokyo Idols by Miyake Kyoko, which I think it delves into this in an interesting way, in the sense that it doesn't just purely demonize the fans, and also indicates that the idols themselves, in many cases, do have a bit of agency, but are also working within a system that gives them very few options. And so, kind of feel compelled to take on this kind of work. And yeah, I think that particularly in the wake of a couple of years ago, there was a very high profile incident in which a young woman, Yamaguchi Maho, who was one of the performers for NGT48, which is one of the subsets of AKB48, the very large idol group, was assaulted outside her apartment, and basically was told to keep quiet, not to make trouble, but did go public and made this very tearful video where she said she didn't feel safe and that the agency wasn't helping her, and then eventually apologized for it because she had again created trouble. But I feel like that did, at least for a moment, kind of start a conversation about the really exploitative practices in this industry, where a lot of these young women sign these essentially indentured servitude contracts for a very long time, and they are often subject to harassment or even assault, but we don't know about it because the agencies keep it quiet. They earn very little money for the amount of work they do, and then for those of them who are in the industry for a very, very long time and eventually graduate, which they have to because they can't do it once they reach a certain age, they often have very few skills, and they have difficulty transitioning into the non-idol world. And to me, so much of that is horrifying. And I think that it, again, I don't think that necessarily the directors and the producers of many of these horror films, who are often connected to the idol agencies themselves, are necessarily trying to present a sympathetic, dark portrait of this industry. But however, inadvertently, it is happening. At least, I can't unsee a lot of the sort of dark things that I'm seeing in a lot of these films.
Yeah, absolutely. But the real contrast, I think, for me is how you hear a lot of young women who are in that drive to become a pop idol, and they see it as kind of something that would make their life complete and whole. And then you see the other side of women in Japan who become pop idols, and it's so dissatisfying, and they lose their independence. And there's so many cases of bullying as well, right, connected to that whole the envy. And the woman who was a pro wrestler, and she committed suicide, and she was getting bullied so badly on social media. There's so many connections from this chapter about idol culture and J horror. One interesting theme that I don't think we've mentioned yet, you touched on it with Blair Witch Project, is the whole focus on using found footage or the mockumentary, and how I think that's an added layer of trying to show this is the reality. We know it's not the reality, but that's an added wrinkle we haven't talked about yet.
Sure. And I think that, found footage has been around for a very long time, even before the Blair Witch Project. I think a lot of people point to the Blair Witch Project as the place where it really took off as a form of mainstream horror around the world. But, it was around before then. And within Japan, interestingly, I think that when people think of J-horror, when they think of films like The Ring, and The Grudge, they don't necessarily immediately think of found footage, because perhaps the most famous forms of J horror are not found footage horror. But actually, if you look at earlier films and kind of the roots of J horror, you find these TV series like the Hontoni Atta Kowai Hanashi, or the True Scary Stories series, which were these short series that aired on television that purported to tell true ghost stories, and were filmed in a kind of mockumentary fashion. And then you have films like Jaganre, or Psychic Vision, which came out in 1988, which is much, quite a while before The Ring and other films. And that is very much a found footage horror film about, people finding this videotape which shows this kind of cursed video production of this pop idol's music video. And so I think that found footage has been connected to J horror for a very long time, even if the most famous movies aren't examples of found footage horror. And now, in the last 10 years, there have been quite a few Japanese horror films that use the found footage format, or at least use it to a certain extent, even if the movie itself is a narrative film, not a found footage horror film, there's usually some little found footage component in there somewhere. Somebody finds a cursed video on Nico Nico or YouTube, or somebody gets a mysterious video call on their cell phone, or even more recently, there have been a couple of kind of Zoom focused horror films as well. And yeah, I think it adds to the very complicated ideas about authenticity, because this is the holy grail these days, that every person who wants to make money on the internet wants, is authenticity. I want the real you, the real thing, which of course I think most of us are savvy enough to realize now is heavily curated. Even stuff that looks rough, even stuff that looks like, oh, I just turned on my camera and this was found. Of course, it's heavily curated. It involves careful framing and careful lighting and careful choices about editing. But if it has that feeling of rawness, and I just found this, then it creates a powerful effect.
That is so true. And I think that connects in many ways to ideas of sustainability, and how we know that more and more people are seeking out more sustainable products and services now. And how do they find out which one is actually ethical or sustainable, better for the environment, better for society than another product? And quite often, the companies are becoming very clever at trickery, right? So this is very connected to the whole idea of authenticity and reality, and using that, well, definitely planned to make it look amateur, but it's done by professionals. Whole idea of the found footage I found really interesting. You also talk about performative authenticity. And I think we saw this in Shinome,
Yeah, Shirome.
the
Mhm.
Shirome, the movie you guys were talking about, how you thought probably it wasn't scripted, to keep that little bit
Yeah.
of maybe they're really going through this kind of
Mhm.
feeling.
Yeah, I mean, based on, again, whenever you're dealing with anything that features pop idols, it's very hard to get to anything resembling the truth, because everything is so heavily curated, and even their origin stories, you have to wonder how much of it is really true. But based on some interviews that I've found with Shirai Shikoji, the director, it does seem like, of course, they had a structure. The film had a structure. It had a series of beats and plot points, and the young women in Momedo Kurova Zeddo, which is the name of the pop group, were certainly given a prompt. They were given a setup where they said, okay, you're in this room, and now I want you to tell us all how you feel about going to this haunted school tomorrow. Um, and so, on the one hand, these young women were being asked to do something they were very familiar with. They were being asked to basically give some version of "I'm going to do my best," which is something they've done a lot before. But I do think that their reactions, when scary things happen, when someone appears to be possessed or something, on the one hand, I'm sure they knew that that wasn't actually real, but on the other hand, their reactions seem quite genuine. Some of them are crying, and they seem very upset. But I think it's also this constant combination of, it's real, but it's also a performance, and it's really hard to kind of separate the two, because idol culture and being an idol is very much about performing emotions. You perform tears when you're supposed to be moved by something. You perform surprise on these, variety shows that so many of them appear on. And I think that if you were to kind of pin them down and say, okay, was that real? It would be very hard to answer that question, because when you live your life in a constant state of being on and performing, that line really starts to blur. And that's another thing that is kind of scary for me, is these very young women are living in a world where, do they really know where the line is between their so-called authentic self and their idol self? And I don't know. I'm not really sure that they can say where that line ends and begins, because it's pretty blurry.
Ah, that's really interesting and very important to keep talking about and discussing and thinking about, and hopefully having discussions with young women and seeing where they stand, and if they are even noticing that that is kind of being perpetuated onto them by the powers
Mm.
that be or by the media as the way they should be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Another great comment
Mm.
from Colleen. She says, I'm so curious about what may have happened during the pandemic with so many people stuck in their homes and afraid to go outside. Have you seen developments in this genre that have tapped into this?
I don't know that I've seen it specifically within Japanese horror. Again, there have been one or two very small films that I've noticed that seem to feature Zoom calls and maybe spooky things happening on Zoom calls. I feel like that was something that happened a lot at the very beginning of the pandemic. People made these kind of remote films, and it was sort of a novelty back when we thought the pandemic was only going to last like 6 months or something. And then I think people quickly got tired of it because it just became a reminder of what we were all dealing with. And so you haven't seen quite as many of those. But I don't know. I have seen a little bit in a couple of recent Japanese horror films, just a little more focus on like kind of hikikomori type people, and characters who tend to spend a lot of time in their room watching YouTube, or in kind of like group chats or something. And that isn't necessarily something we didn't see before the pandemic. But maybe we are seeing it a little bit more now. Beyond Japan, of course, I've seen, there was the horror film Host, which premiered on Shudder, which is a Zoom-based horror film. Um, and then even just stuff like Bo Burnham's Inside, which there's this performance piece that he made while he was kind of in quarantine that just tried to express the feelings of all these people trapped inside. And so yeah, I think that even if we're not necessarily seeing like pandemic horror films, like films about the pandemic, I think it has to be informing the creative impulses of the people who are making these films. So I do think it's showing up indirectly in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Enrique says pandemic data stats are
Yeah.
enough horror for the moment. That's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this a bit in my book's conclusion, like, during the pandemic, especially as it got longer, I remember thinking to myself that I wasn't going to be able to watch horror at this time because there was so much horror playing out all around me, and I was just going to be seeking out, fluffy kitten videos or something. But in fact, I actually did seek out a lot of horror during the pandemic because horror is often an escape for a lot of people, and it's cathartic. And putting on this film, which has people dealing with monsters and ghosts, it can be a way of looking at a different type of scary, when your day-to-day scary is just worrying about getting sick or your loved ones dying. A movie about vampires or werewolves or haunted internet can be a release in a way. It's a way to experience a different kind of fear from a safe vantage point. So yeah, that was surprising that horror was still an outlet for me during the pandemic.
Isn't that interesting? Like you would have been scared before, but now your reality has become so scary that actually horror is kind of a escape from our scary
Yeah, yeah,
reality.
escaping one horror for another, basically.
Yeah, but the ridiculousness of
Mm.
horror is kind of comforting in a way, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think perhaps that's why we haven't seen just a ton of pandemic-themed horror films, because perhaps the creators knew that that was maybe not what people were seeking at the time.
They have enough of that from
Yeah.
the news, right?
Yes. Yes.
Now, one unfortunate connection to your next chapter is pandemic related with the increase in suicides. During the pandemic, especially in Japan, we saw more children and more women committing suicide than ever before. The rates went up quite a lot. Um, Unfortunately, that's a horrible but common theme in Japanese horror films about suicide forests, which you covered in the next chapter. Is that right?
Yeah, so I had a chapter on just kind of depictions of Aokigahara, sometimes called the suicide forest, in both Japanese and non-Japanese media. And this is something I've actually been working on for a long time. just because I was curious long before the famous or infamous Logan Paul incident where this YouTuber went and filmed himself kind of offensively in Aokigahara and was roundly condemned for it. I was just really interested in how Aokigahara had become a popular topic for YouTubers and, just kind of people wandering into the forest with selfie sticks and talking about how creepy it was. And then also there was a period where there were several movies, one right after the other, non-Japanese movies, like The Forest, Forest of the Living Dead, and a bunch, the People Garden. There were just these kind of like cheap knockoff horror films. I think The Forest was maybe the most expensive one. And it seemed to be just kind of an endless source of fascination for a lot of people. But I also had very mixed feelings about that, of course, because this is a real place where real people have actually gone to die. And, I wasn't sure how I felt about people kind of sensationalizing this. And not surprisingly, a lot of content related to Aokigahara in English tended to be connected to a lot of sort of Orientalist notions of Japan as particularly weird and depraved, and there isn't this stigma against suicide in Japan like there is in the West, and all of that was just, I thought, very problematic and messy. So I tried to do a lot more sort of in-depth research and see where a lot of that came from, and also what a lot of these films were drawing from. And basically, I think that films, and interestingly, there have been recently there was a Japanese horror film called Suicide's Forest Village, which was made in the forest, and they managed to get the prefecture to lift their usual ban on filming there. And this, to me, was one of the first kind of big budget examples of a Japanese horror film actually going into the forest to film. And one of the reasons, at least they claim, one of the reasons they were allowed to film in there was because this film, Suicide Forest Village, was kind of far from the reality. It was not really a film about suicide. It was not a film that claimed to, trace the history or anything. It was purely fantastical, and it imagined this kind of like haunted village in the middle of the forest. And that to me was really fascinating, that on the one hand, you have a lot of these films that are striving for authenticity in a kind of documentary feel, but the reason that this film was allowed to take its cameras into the forest, at least according to the prefectural government, was because it was not realistic, and that they were then okay with it.
That is so interesting. And it's kind of like a way for the government or the destination to control the narrative or
Yes.
diffuse the actual reality
Yeah.
by showing it in a different way, which seemed fake, even though that is reflecting what is really happening. It's
Exactly.
really wild.
Yeah, it is. And I talk in the chapter a little bit as well about how they kind of tried to have their cake and eat it too, because they had this very scary movie, but then the production company actually collaborated with Yamanashi Prefecture and used one of the actresses from the film still wearing her same outfit and playing her same YouTuber character in this short, like 30-second ad that ran on YouTube, just showing the scenic beauty of the forest, and basically with text that said things like, come take a journey to this magical power spot that is Aokigahara. So it was really, I think, about Yamanashi Prefecture trying to control and kind of reclaim the narrative, which is something they've actually been doing for quite a while. Yamanashi Prefecture has been working to hire nature guides and to put out, kind of their own brochures and information about the forest as a scenic hiking spot, because they know that if they can encourage a lot of like hiking tourism and there are a lot of people in the forest, then people are less likely to go there to try to die, because it will be less isolated. If it's full of people are less likely to do that. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate exercise, because obviously the long history of suicide in Aokigahara has been incredibly traumatic. for the prefecture, for the people who work in the gift shops and things, who have often had to become involuntary suicide counselors because they are the last point of contact for people who go into the forest, and also the economic toll. Whenever a body is found in Aokigahara, the prefecture has to deal with it. It's often unclaimed, and they don't necessarily have the budget to do that. And obviously, these are average people who suddenly have to deal with large numbers of bodies. So really, anything that Yamanashi Prefecture wants to do to change or reclaim the narrative, I think is great.
Well, I mean, you could look at it at a more proactive aspect. Like, why not get suicide counselors to go work with the local people and help train the people in the local shop to have. In Japan, we have the 119 posters everywhere for kids who are in trouble to call a helpline, or you can come in this shop and you can get support. We know that's happening in that area. Why not engage with the locals and get them to be that support network that's lacking?
Yeah, and it has happened. I think they have done a lot of that work. I guess for me, the kind of frustrating thing about it is that in some cases you have a group of people who the only thing they signed up for was to be, a cashier. They didn't necessarily sign up to be a counselor, and now they have kind of been forced into that role. But the good news is that yes, also Yamanashi Prefecture is collaborating with experts and with professionals to kind of help deal with this problem. But for some people, it's just kind of like, I didn't ask for this, but now this is what I am because
Well,
it
especially
can't be helped.
if they go into a job not knowing
Yeah,
the history of the area,
exactly right.
before they start, definitely they would need some counseling as well.
Sure.
Yeah, interesting. There was one part of that chapter that I also thought was really interesting. You were talking about the pieces of the forest literally breaking and then
Mm.
coming together again and then breaking again. And could that be like a reflection on our environmental problems in a way that the idol culture going into the abandoned school or abandoned building is also a reflection of societal change in Japan, the aging population, abandoned buildings? Could that reflect kind of climate change or nature breaking
Yeah,
down?
I haven't really thought about climate change in relation to Aokigahara, but when we talk about abandoned buildings and when we talk about like derelict buildings and kind of the emptying of the countryside, absolutely, I think that this is a big part of it. And I actually, one of my upcoming projects relates to haunted houses and everything that means when we talk about a haunted house or a haunted space. And I'm particularly interested in how certain spaces become derelict and become run down. And in Japan, yes, a lot of times it is specifically related to the depopulation of the countryside, also the declining birth rate, and the fact that when it comes to schools, there just aren't enough young people. And I think that the haunted school or the abandoned school is just such a potent image in so many horror films and in Japanese horror films in particular, because you have this juxtaposition of this like charming, nostalgic place that is now covered in weeds and mold and, is just kind of slowly died from lack of use. And to go back to the image of Aokigahara, there's a music video that I talk about that was filmed there, where you have like an image of the forest and then it just kind of shatters like glass. You have all of these pieces of the forest kind of shattering and then they slowly come back together. And for me, I think that definitely was kind of a potent image of how our idea of certain places is kind of fractured and put back together with different movies where we take all the pieces and we sort of put them together into something new. But yeah, I think it could also relate to the way that obviously our relationship with nature is pretty broken and fractured at this point, and we're all trying to kind of rebuild into something different. But in terms of empty buildings, the depopulation of the countryside. That is something that I'm really interested in terms of how Japanese cinema deals with that and how Japanese horror specifically deals with it.
Well, it's so important to have the art or the media or the filmmakers involved in these conversations and highlighting it in their own way, including horror filmmakers. I find that so interesting and something I've never thought about before. There's a lot of Japanese films or Korean films that really expose social inequities, right? Like the Korean film that won Parasite, that
Yes,
won all the
sure.
awards a couple years ago. It's a really important part of how we understand and how we are aware of what's happening in our own world somehow, right?
Yeah, and I think this for me is has always been one of the fundamental fascinating things about horror is that whether we like it or not, and whether the directors and filmmakers and creators intend it or not, horror is fundamentally about what it means to be human. And part of what it means to be human is what are we scared of and what are we afraid of losing? And I think that horror films kind of sneakily explore that because if you're watching a horror film and you're coming to it as a horror fan or something, you're probably just expecting some freaky escapism. But before you know it, there's more there. And I don't know that necessarily the filmmakers or the creators sit down and say, okay, I'm going to make an issue film or I'm going to make a film that has a message about this. But it can't be helped because if you are a creator and you're making something that is about what scares people and you want to effectively scare people, of course you're going to tap into something very primal. You're going to tap into, culturally specific fears. When it comes to some Japanese horror films, you're going to tap into, fears of loneliness and social isolation, particularly in large cities. And more recently, the fear of technology and how omnipresent it's become in our lives. And so I think that in that way, horror can be this wonderful vehicle for sort of sneaking in the healthy food with the junk food, so to speak, where on the one hand, people come to horror thinking it's just going to be pulpy and silly and fun. But historically, it has very much been a vehicle for exploring really complicated issues.
Absolutely. I think we'll start to see more and more pollution related horror films, if not already. Wasn't Godzilla came from a nuclear
Oh,
accident? I mean,
yes.
we know that climate change and the climate crisis has inspired a lot of filmmakers. Have you seen that in horror?
Oh my
Yeah.
God. I mean, I think that perhaps I'm seeing it a lot more in science fiction. These days we even talk about cli-fi, is this kind of new breed of science fiction. But of course, I think that the recent Shin Gojira, the Godzilla Resurgence film, of course, was kind of got a lot of attention because it featured so many scenes that for many people were reminiscent of the tsunami and quake, and also just environmental devastation and the origin of Godzilla, yes, is from a nuclear bomb and a nuclear disaster. And I think the very first Godzilla film from many years ago really is a tragedy. I think that's what a lot of people forget when they think of Godzilla from the 1960s that was kind of cute and silly, and then the more recent Godzilla films that are basically just action films, that the original Godzilla was very much played as a tragedy. And it was played as, this example of an unstoppable force of destruction, which at the time I think was more connected to war, but could also absolutely be connected to environmental devastation. And so we're seeing a lot. Obviously, horror has often dealt with plagues and pandemics, but definitely touches on the realities of climate change and what happens when there's just kind of this unstoppable force that we ignore until we can't anymore. And even if it's not the main subject, I feel like it's kind of always in the background of a lot of these films.
Yeah, interesting. Colleen says, so relevant to more positive depictions, cool Japan, etc., but inspires us to think more critically about depictions of space, place, people in the past. And great. Yeah, awesome comment. Thanks, Colleen.
Yeah, we academics love to talk about space, I think, but it is important. Yes, it's I think that when we think about Japan, yeah, there has often been this particular narrative of what Japan is and what its people are. But if we delve really deeply into particular spaces and places like derelict buildings or haunted schools or depopulated rural spaces and things like that, we can learn so much. We can, I think, extrapolate from that and just make all kinds of connections to really interesting aspects of history and culture and social issues.
Yeah. And in terms of the work that I do, trying to work with destinations or businesses, trying to promote what they are doing, which is sustainable, you have to be really careful about being honest. Like this is what we're doing. It's better than usual, but these are the hurdles that we're having. And I think that's a problem with Cool Japan PR or any Cool Britannica PR or Come to America PR, right? Like it's only the gloss and nothing, none of the reality. So hopefully we can have more balance in perspective through horror and all kinds of media, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
We just have about 5 minutes left. Is there something we haven't talked about or something you've got coming up? New articles you're working on?
Yeah, well, actually, Professor Laird is working on a wonderful new series on Japanese women directors, which I am a part of, and specifically talking about women horror directors, of which there are not that many, actually, but there is a really wonderful director named Asato Mari, who's made some very interesting films that very often focus on women and women's lives. So that's something I'm working on. And then much further into the future, probably, I hope that my second book project will again be focused on haunted houses and everything that means. So I want to take a look at specifically how Japanese cinema and mostly Japanese horror cinema has dealt with these kinds of haunted spaces and old buildings and the like traditional Japanese buildings versus modern buildings. And really, architecture is kind of my second love, and it's not something I'm an expert in, but this project will give me an excuse to travel and look at a lot of very interesting buildings and also read a lot about architecture. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, architecture is so exciting. Especially like we talked about abandoned buildings. I interview so many people who are remodeling old traditional houses, but also finding new ways to live more comfortably in small spaces and other unique designs. I think isn't there like an impression that Japanese people are not creative? I don't know where that comes from because Japanese people are so inventive and creative. And
Yeah,
there's so
I
many
feel like
great
maybe, yeah,
ideas.
they're the sort of blanket stereotypes about Japan, or that Japan is a very kind of mathematical society, and that, which is, yeah, that's ridiculous. Obviously, there's a ton of creativity in Japan, particularly in the architecture world. I think there are amazing Japanese architects who are doing wonderful things with sustainable architecture, and just with beautiful building designs. I love walking around Tokyo and just finding these absolute gems of sometimes new, sometimes much older buildings, and buildings that combine traditional Japanese architecture with much older stuff. Places like Kanazawa are just fascinating to see what's going on there. So yeah, I think Japan is an architectural dream for me.
Yeah, so interesting. One more thing I think when we're talking about horror or depictions of reality, which you probably see when you walk around Tokyo and see these buildings, is how the private space is kept, but the use of windows in special areas to take the outside view inside is such an interesting part of Japanese architectural design.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the running themes through the book as well is this idea of the virtual window. And when I say that, I'm talking about Anne Friedberg's concept, but also just this idea of how we're surrounded by windows, whether it's the frames that I'm looking at right now through which we're seeing this video, whether it's our smartphones, whether it's our laptops, whether it's the physical windows that I'm looking out of at my office, and all of these windows literally frame how we see the world. And so within Japanese architecture, yeah, you have this very interesting use of both public and private space, and how, private space is usually very hidden. I'm always kind of fascinated by how the exterior of a Japanese building will often be very, neat and careful, but then inside it will sometimes be really chaotic. And there'll be just kind of like a lot of things stacked on top of each other. But yeah, you have, sometimes shaded windows that give you like a partial view, but you're not really seeing the whole thing. But then if you go into traditional, like, minka or other kinds of like older Japanese buildings, there'll be these very large open window spaces. And I remember like sitting back in the countryside and just having this like pastoral view in front of me that's just perfectly framed, by this little window space. And yeah, it's fascinating how it creates this really interesting border between outside and inside.
Well, I appreciate that about your work, that you're helping open up these views that many of us have never thought about before. And these views through horror films or Japanese media, which is framing our reality in new ways and helping us appreciate kind of a wider conversation about this. So thank you so much for all you do.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all the great comments, everyone, for joining today. Really enjoyed engaging with you as well. And we were talking about abandoned houses, right? This coming Saturday, 9 a.m., I'm talking with the organizers of a Minka Summit. So there's going to be a abandoned house remodel, old houses conference or event happening in April, and they'll be talking about that this week, Saturday, 9 a.m. So please join us if you're interested in that. And Colleen says, Lindsay is doing fantastic work as well, like you mentioned. And thank you for the great conversation. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Have a great day. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.